He thought he knew the game. He walked into this with the specific confidence of someone who has played this particular game before and won, who has learned through a sufficient number of prior experiences exactly which moves produce which results in exactly which order, who has a model of how dynamics like this one tend to unfold, and who believed, perhaps without consciously thinking about it as believing, that the model would apply here. It did not apply here because you are not a person who plays that game, not because you have a strategy against it, not because you identified what he was doing and responded with a counter move of your own, because the game requires a particular kind of participation from both sides to function, because it needs the other person to be responding to the moves rather than simply being who they are regardless of what moves are being made. You did not respond to the moves. You simply continued to be who you are. And that specific, complete game immune quality of simply continuing to be who you are is the most effective thing that has ever happened to his model. I want to begin with what the lesson actually was, because the title names it and I want to give it its full, honest content rather than leaving it as a vague, satisfying concept. He discovered that you cannot be managed. That is the first piece of the lesson. The specific, slightly disorienting discovery that the usual toolkit for navigating relationships on his own terms, the calibrated availability and the strategic timing and the careful management of how much he shows and when and in what form, does not produce the expected result when applied to you, because you do not respond to the toolkit in the way the toolkit is designed to produce responses, not because you analyzed it and decided not to, because you were not monitoring the toolkit, because your attention was not organized around what he was doing or how he was presenting or what he was trying to communicate through the particular sequencing of his behavior. Your attention was somewhere else, on your own life, on the things that actually matter to you, on the specific, internally directed, not about him quality of someone who has enough going on that another person's strategic behavior is not the most interesting thing happening in the available landscape. He applied the toolkit to someone who was not watching the toolkit, and the toolkit applied to someone who is not watching it simply lands in empty air. Let me describe what happened from his perspective, because the lesson cannot be fully understood without understanding what the learning felt like from the inside of the person being educated. He made a move, not a dramatic move, the kind of move that is calibrated to produce a particular result, a specific quality of response that tells him he has registered correctly on you, something that in previous dynamics has reliably produced the response he was looking for. That has been the go-to in situations of this nature because it has worked in situations of this nature. He sent it and waited, and the response was not what the model predicted. Not because you were playing hardball, not because you were running a counter strategy of your own designed to signal a particular thing, because the response was simply you responding from where you actually were, which was not oriented toward him in the way the move assumed you would be oriented. The move landed on someone who was genuinely occupied with other things. And the specific, genuine quality of your occupation with other things, which is something that cannot be performed convincingly, because genuine occupation has a texture that the performance of occupation does not, produced in him the particular quality of not landing, of his move simply not producing the expected effect. He waited longer. Still not the expected response. He recalibrated, made a different move, applied a different approach from the toolkit, something that had also worked before and that he had reason to believe would work here. Same result. Not landing. I want to speak to what happens inside a person when their model fails repeatedly, because this is the piece of the lesson that produced the actual learning rather than simply the confusion. The first failure of the model produces an explanation. Something went wrong with the execution. The timing was off. The specific move was not quite right for this particular context. Adjustment needed. The model is fine. The application needs refinement. The second failure produces another explanation. Different explanation than the first. Still preserving the model, still assuming that the failure is a function of the execution rather than a function of the model's fundamental unsuitability for this situation. The third failure begins to shake something. Not the model entirely, not yet, but something. The specific, uncomfortable quality of evidence accumulating against an assumption that had been held with confidence. The particular discomfort of a pattern of results that does not fit the expected distribution. And at a certain point, when the failures have accumulated beyond what can be explained by execution errors, what shakes is the model itself. He had to ask himself a question he had not been expecting to have to ask. What if this person is simply different from the people the model was built for? He had to ask himself a question he had not been expecting to have to ask. What if this person is simply different from the people the model was built for? I want to stay with that question for a moment because I think it is one of the more genuinely uncomfortable questions available to someone who has organized a significant portion of their relational life around a particular model of how things work, because the question does not only apply to this situation. Once you ask it about one person, it begins to apply retroactively to everything you thought you understood about how dynamics of this kind function, to every confident move you made in the past that you understood as effective because it produced the response you expected, to the entire edifice of the approach that has been, until now, something you were certain about. One person being genuinely different does not only teach you something about that one person, it teaches you something about the model itself, about what it was selecting for, about the quality of the responses it was designed to produce, about whether the things it was effective at producing were the things that are actually worth producing. He is sitting inside those questions now. And the sitting is productive, even if it is not comfortable. Let me speak to that question, because it is the hinge of the lesson. The moment where the confusion became actual learning rather than simply frustration. The question required him to look at you, not at his own moves and their execution and what adjustments might improve their effectiveness, at you, at the specific, actual, unmodeled quality of who you are. When he put down the toolkit long enough to simply look at what was actually in front of him, and what he saw when he finally looked without the overlay of the model was someone who was not participating in what he had assumed was happening. Not someone who was refusing to participate, not someone who was aware of the game and was making a conscious choice not to play it. Someone who was genuinely elsewhere, genuinely occupied, genuinely organized around her own life and her own priorities and her own internal landscape in a way that was not leaving adequate bandwidth for the monitoring of his moves that the game required. The game requires two players. he had been playing alone, and the recognition of that, the specific, slightly humbling, impossible to argue with recognition that he had been executing a sophisticated strategy against someone who had no idea the strategy was being executed, produced the particular quality of sheepishness that is the beginning of actual education. I want to speak to the lesson itself now, not the lesson as he experienced it, which I have been describing, the lesson as it actually is, the actual truth that the situation delivered to him. There are no games with you, not as a rule you have set, not as a position you have taken after careful deliberation about how you want to be treated, as a simple structural fact about how you exist in the world. You do not play games, not because you have principles against them. You do not play games because you do not think that way. Because the specific strategic move and counter move quality of game playing requires a particular orientation toward relationships that is fundamentally different from yours. One that treats interactions as things to be navigated toward desired outcomes through the careful management of impression and availability and timing. And your orientation is simply not that. Your orientation is direct, is honest, is organized around what is actually true rather than what is strategically advantageous to present as true, is built on the assumption, not always rewarded but consistently held, that the actual version of things is more worth engaging with than the managed version. That directness, that honesty, that unstrategic quality of simply being what you are when you are with people is the specific thing that the game cannot function against. Because the game needs something to push against and you do not push back. You simply do not register the push because the game needs something to push against and you do not push back. You simply do not register the push. I want to give that one more layer of specificity because I think it is the most important piece for your own understanding of what happened. The game, when it is functioning as designed, creates a feedback loop. Move, response, adjusted move, adjusted response, each side informing the other, each side's behavior calibrated by what the other side is doing. The game requires both people to be inside the loop, responding to each other, for the dynamic to develop in the direction the game player is trying to develop it. You broke the loop, not by refusing to enter it, by not being in the loop in the first place, by being in a different kind of interaction entirely, one that is not organized around the dynamic he was trying to create, but around what is actually true between two people who are both fully present. The feedback loop, when only one person is inside it, simply stops. There is no response to calibrate the next move to. There is no adjusted response to the adjusted move. There is just you being yourself in the ordinary, unremarkable, entirely genuine way that you are yourself. And a game with no feedback cannot continue. It simply ends with him alone in it. Tell me in the comments if you have felt this dynamic in your life. The specific, slightly surreal experience of eventually understanding that someone was playing a game you did not know was being played, of realizing that moves were being made that you were not responding to in the expected way, of understanding in retrospect the gap between what was being executed and what was actually happening. Tell me if this reading is landing on something real. Let me speak to what he is sitting with now. because the lesson is not simply an intellectual one. It has an emotional component that I think is worth naming. He is embarrassed, not dramatically, not in a way that is producing visible distress that anyone else would notice. In the quiet, private, sits with you when you are alone kind of embarrassment that comes from having been sophisticated in your approach to something that turned out not to require or even notice your sophistication, from having deployed resources on something that was not paying attention to the deployment. There is a specific kind of ego that is invested in the game that takes a certain amount of pride in playing it well, that understands its own skill at managing dynamics and receives that understanding as a form of self-esteem. And when that specific ego encounters the proof that its skill was not only ineffective but irrelevant, the specific embarrassment of that is particular and not comfortable. He thought he was several moves ahead. He was playing against himself, but underneath the embarrassment, something else. Something that I want to name directly because it is the piece that has the most significance for what comes next. A correction, a genuine, not previously available correction to the specific thing that was wrong with how he has been approaching people in this territory. Because the lesson did not only teach him that the game does not work with you, it taught him something more fundamental, that the game as a general strategy for navigating intimacy produces the specific result of people who are worth having not being moved by it. Because people who are worth having are almost by definition people who are not organized around being managed, who have enough internal resource, enough genuine occupation with their own lives and their own development, enough fundamental self-possession to not be particularly responsive to the calibration of availability and the timing of moves. The game was built for a different audience, and he has encountered the audience it was not built for. And the encounter has produced in him a very specific and very uncomfortable question about everything he thought he knew about this. I want to speak to what this means for what comes next, because lessons, when they are genuine, change behavior. He is going to come back, not with the game. He knows now that the game is the wrong tool for this, that the specific calculated approach that worked elsewhere will not work here and has not worked here, and that the attempting of it is not going to produce different results regardless of how it is refined. He is going to come back differently with a specific, slightly awkward, I do not know exactly how to do this quality of someone who is accustomed to knowing how to do everything in this territory and who has been stripped of that certainty by the specific, effective, entirely unconscious way that you simply being yourself stripped it. He is going to try the actual thing, not the managed version, the actual version, the version where he is genuinely present rather than strategically available, where he says what is actually true rather than what produces the desired effect, where he shows up as who he actually is rather than who he has calculated it is most advantageous to appear to be. He has never done this in quite this context before. It is going to be more vulnerable than he is accustomed to. And it is going to arrive in a way that is immediately distinguishable from everything he attempted before, because it is going to be real. And you who do not respond to what is not real are going to respond to what is. He has never done this in quite this context before. It is going to be more vulnerable than he is accustomed to. And it is going to arrive in a way that is immediately distinguishable from everything he attempted before, because it is going to be real. And you who do not respond to what is not real are going to respond to what is. I want to describe what the real version of this person looks like when it shows up, because the contrast between the game version you encountered and the real version that is now preparing to emerge is significant, and I think knowing the difference will help you receive the real version for what it is, rather than extending the skepticism that the game version rightfully earned. The real version is less polished, not careless, less polished, in the specific way of someone who is no longer working from a script, who is saying what he is actually thinking rather than what he has calculated is the most effective thing to say, who is responding in real time rather than from a prepared position. It may seem less certain of itself than the game version was, because it is less certain of itself, because genuine presence in the direction of someone you actually care about is inherently more uncertain than the execution of a strategy, which has a known structure even when the outcome is uncertain. The uncertainty is actually the signal. The uncertainty is what tells you this is the real version. Receive it accordingly. As we close, I want to leave you with the full picture of what actually happened here. You did not teach him this lesson through any deliberate action. You did not plan it, engineer it, strategize it, or execute it. You did not identify what he was doing and decide to counter-program it. You did not protect yourself by raising your defenses or by being deliberately difficult or by any of the effortful things that people sometimes do when they sense that a game is being played at them. You simply lived your life. You were occupied with what you are actually occupied with. You were interested in what you are actually interested in. You were oriented toward what you are actually oriented toward. And that genuine, self-directed, him not in the center quality of how you inhabit your own life was the most effective possible response to everything he was doing. Not because it was designed to be effective, because it was true. And truth, when encountered by someone who has been operating in the territory of performance, tends to produce a very specific quality of disorientation that eventually becomes education. You did not give him a lesson. You simply were yourself, and yourself was the lesson.